Hey guys, so this is going to be the short version of the progressive presidents and kind of what they did to further aid the progressive movement. So the first of these presidents is Teddy Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt became president when William McKinley, who was president before him, was shot. Roosevelt was the vice president. He had actually become vice president because the Republican Party was a little nervous about him. He had served in many offices and had kind of showed that he couldn't be controlled by the Republican Party. So they said, well, what's the one office we can put him in where he won't have any power? Well, he can be vice president. The problem is if the president dies, vice president becomes the next president, which is exactly what happened. So Theodore Roosevelt becomes president and really just kind of goes underway to start making reforms in the country because he really believed that it was the job of the president to kind of help people. So the first thing that he does is he offers what he calls the square deal. So the square deal is just kind of the name for all his reforms. And the first thing he wants to do is get rid of all these trusts that are taking advantage of people. So he uses the Sherman Antitrust Act to file suit against over 44 different trusts and break up all of those trusts that were taking advantage, particularly the railroad industry. This earns him the nickname the Lion Tamer, the Trust Tamer. The thing is that he saw that there were things as good and bad trusts. So he really believed that some monopolies were okay as long as they weren't kind of taking advantage. So he really only busted up trusts that he thought were bad. So that he did draw this distinction, which I think is important to keep in mind. And one of those distinctions was the railroad monopolies. He really saw that the railroad monopolies were taking advantage. Think when we were going over the populist movement, that was their main issue, right? So he sets up the Interstate Commerce Act, which establishes the fact that railroads have to basically, or that the railroads are going to be regulated by the industry or by their government. The Elkins Act gives fines for anyone receiving a kickback or for railroads offering kickbacks. The Hepburn Act increases the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, sets maximum costs so the railroads can't overcharge, and outlaws any free passes that are given on the railroads. So this is kind of his way of showing the government has the power to regulate businesses. The next thing that we have is the coal strike happening in Pennsylvania. So coal is the main industry in our country at this time, and everybody in the country depends on coal for heating their homes. So when the coal miners go on strike asking for better wages and a shorter workday, the country basically shuts down, and we're getting into winter. And it gets to the point where Roosevelt says, we can't let this just play out on its own. So Theodore Roosevelt steps in to mediate between the coal miners and the the management. And he threatens to send in federal troops, saying, if you can't come to an agreement, I'm going to nationalize this coal mine, I'm going to take it over completely, and then you'll all be out of a job. He at one point threatened to throw the manager out of the window because he was annoying him so much. But in the end, the coal strikers get exactly what they want. They get a salary increase and a maximum 9-hour workday. And Congress establishes the Department of Commerce and Labor, which allows the federal government to continue to regulate commerce and to regulate labor unions as well. And this was considered to be one of the biggest achievements of Roosevelt's presidency. The next thing that we have are patent medicines. So basically at this time period, anybody could sell whatever they wanted to, and call it a medicine. So it could be something harmless like water mixed with some flavorings, or it could be cocaine in tooth drops, right, that are marketed towards children. Snake oil was another famous one, which was probably just whiskey in a bottle. You see this one over here. The fat banisher is a tapeworm that you swallow. Basically, people were able to sell whatever they wanted and claim whatever they wanted. At the same time, we also see that the meatpacking industry is completely disgusting. You remember when we read The Jungle? Roosevelt read it too, and he was appalled. So immediately he passes 2 acts. The Meat Inspection Act, which allows the federal government to inspect meat plants and make sure that they are clean and up to standard. Then he passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which bans any mislabeling of medicine. It controls the shippings of medicine across state lines and establishes the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which allows the federal government to inspect medicines and to make sure that they're not harmful, that they're helpful, right? Because you don't want to take a medicine that's going to hurt you. So this is kind of his way of cleaning up the labeling and the food industry. Last thing that we have here for Roosevelt, for some of his reforms, is conservation. So Roosevelt's an outdoorsman. He loves the outdoors, and he really sees that the outdoors are America's national treasure. So he sets aside 148 million acres for farmlands as part of the National Park movement. This was a movement led by a man named John Muir, who establishes Yosemite National Park, and he establishes more plans for further conservation in the country. He also passes the Natural Reclamation Act. So as this act, he appoints Guilford Pinchot as head of the U.S. Park Service, and together they work for a plan to kind of so the government can sort of figure out how and where land and water would be distributed. They build dams, reservoirs, power plants, set aside lands for conservation, but again, it's not a total conservation because some of this land is going to be used. So you can see here, this is some of the lands that were set aside in 1908 as part of Theodore Roosevelt's National Forest Movement. So that's a really big portion of our country. The last thing that Roosevelt does is his dealings with civil rights. So as with most men in the country at this time, Roosevelt, he's a little racist. He definitely sees that civil rights is not a top priority. However, as compared to most men, he does sort of open the door for equality. He does appoint several African Americans to federal office, and he invites the most famous black man in the country at the time, Booker T. Washington, to dinner. This is primarily a symbolic gesture saying that I support equality. However, when you look at his actual steps, he doesn't really do anything to end segregation or to support any federal anti-lynching laws. So lynching is a major problem going on majorly in the South, but all over the country, really. And he doesn't really do anything to put that to an end. So most of his movements are symbolic for civil rights, but he doesn't really take a major stand with civil rights. So Roosevelt, as you can see, is really the beginning of the progressive presidency. He played a lot of different roles, but he's going to be the first modern president, the role of the president being involved in regulation of business and society. But when it comes to the end of Roosevelt's second term, he had promised he was not going to run again. So he chooses a hand-picked successor, his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. So William Howard Taft was not the same kind of guy as Roosevelt. They were really close friends at the time, but he was not as pushy as Roosevelt. He was a stress eater. He actually weighed more than any other president. At one point, he weighed almost 400 pounds. He actually got stuck in the White House bathtub at one point, and they had to put in a new bathtub to sustain his weight. And really, he only became president because his wife wanted him to and Roosevelt wanted him to. And Roosevelt really believed that Taft was going to follow on with some of his progressive policies. So Taft, he as president, he's very conservative, but he's very cautious. He doesn't, barge in the way Roosevelt would. So some things that he did as president. First of all, he did not make the distinction like Roosevelt did between good and bad trust. He saw all trust as being bad, and he busted up over 90 trusts, about 99 different trusts. The next thing that he does is he passes an act called the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910. This allows the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate not only the railroad, but also telegraphs and telephone rates. He also creates the modern-day budget proposal. So up until this point, the president had not proposed a budget to Congress the way that they do today. So this is the first time that a budget proposal comes from the president. So Taft is the first president to do that. However, a lot of the steps he took were maybe not so great. The first of these is the Payne-Aldrich tariff. So the Payne-Aldrich tariff, progressives were really hoping that the government would lower the tariff, and the Payne-Aldrich tariff didn't really do that. Roosevelt thought that Taft might veto it, but instead he signs it, saying that it is the best tariff that's ever been signed in our country. So his support of that tariff really gained him a lot of criticism. He also proposed the income tax amendment. So an income tax is a tax based on the money that you make. This was first done by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and then it went away after the Civil War was over, and there was still some controversy over whether or not this was something that the federal government could even do. So he is the first one that kind of gets that amendment underway. It will not be passed while he is president, but it is under his presidency that it starts to be passed. The biggest controversy of his presidency, though, probably had to deal with the Secretary of Interior, Richard Ballinger. So Richard Ballinger was allowing a lot of these lands that had been set aside for conservation to go to corporations. Pinchot is one of Ballinger's biggest critics, and Taft fires him. So remember, Pinchot was the one that was supported by Roosevelt as the head of the U.S. Park Service, and he gets fired, and Taft throws his support to Ballinger instead. So this is seen as like a real step back for conservation. He also supports a guy named Joe Cannon. Joe Cannon is the Speaker of the House, and he is a Republican. And because he's a Republican, Taft really believes that he should support what he does because they're in the same political party. However, Joe Cannon is anti-reform, may have even been a part of a political machine. And so this kind of makes Taft look a little sketch, right? Doesn't really make him look like he really supports reform himself. So in 1911, when the new election is starting to go underway, Roosevelt's really upset. He tries to get Taft to back down. Taft refuses to. He says, no, I'm going to run for another term. So the election of 1912 ends up being a four-way competition between Taft, Roosevelt, a man named Woodrow Wilson, and Eugene Debs, who runs for the Socialist Party. But really, it's going to be a major battle between Roosevelt and Taft. So Roosevelt decides he's going to run under the New Progressive Party. He says, I am as strong as a bull moose, and you can use me to the limit. And he gains a lot of support while he is running under this party. And he really draws a lot of the support away from William Howard Taft. So as you can see here, there was it says, well, I guess old friends are the best, right? So these old friends, Taft and Roosevelt, are just going at it and fighting. In the end, that ends up splitting the Republican vote, and both Roosevelt and Taft lose the election, and the election of 1912 goes to Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson ran under the Democratic Party, and Taft, as you can see, looks pretty happy to be giving the presidency over to Mr. Wilson. So Wilson, as a Democrat, does support a lot of the reforms that we're going to see. So the first thing that Wilson promises is what he calls his new freedom. So this is going to be his economic reforms. So Woodrow Wilson, first thing he does is strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act with an act called the Clayton Antitrust Act. This says that the government cannot use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up labor unions, and he also defined what an unfair trade practice was, giving monopoly a real definition for the first time. So this makes it easier for the federal government to break up those monopolies. Then he passes the Federal Trade Act. This kind of defines some further illegal business practices, again, making it so that the government is really holding a hand in regulating business. He also passes the Underwood Tariff, which did what the Payne-Aldrich Tariff would not, which is lowered the tariff for the first time in quite some time. Under him, the 16th Amendment is passed, which is that income tax amendment that Taft had started, but he makes it a graduated income tax so that the wealthy pay more. And then he establishes the Federal Reserve System. So there was basically, because of the whole bimetallism issue, there was a big issue with the money supply problem. So the Federal Reserve System is basically the basis for today's national banking system. It made it easier for people to borrow money, and it basically allowed the currency to kind of become stable. Because of this, Woodrow Wilson was put on the $100,000 bill, which is only used by the Federal Reserve, or at least it was. It's no longer used. But this really is the basis for the way our money system works even today. In terms of social issues, Wilson was had a little bit more problems. First of all, he actually, as a Southerner by birth, he's probably one of the more racist presidents we ever had. And rather than working for civil rights, he actually expands federal segregation in federal offices in Washington, D.C., and actively opposes an anti-lynching law, saying it's the state's jurisdiction. So rather than just, Roosevelt just kind of didn't do anything, he actively opposes civil rights, which is a big issue for a lot of African Americans who thought that Wilson was going to support them. He also passes a Working Man's Compensation Act. This allows that if a civil service employee of the government was temporarily disabled, that he could continue to continue to collect his wages. So if you ever heard of Workman's Comp, this is the first Workman's Comp Act. However, he didn't always support labor. In Ludlow, Massachusetts, there was a massacre when coal miners were demanding a union and went on strike. They set up kind of this little like shanty town, and the National Guard of the state opened fire on the shanty town and burned it to the ground. 26 men, women, and children died, and Wilson didn't really do anything to support the workers. Once the town went up in flames, he did send in federal troops in order to restore order, but he didn't always support the workers in this situation. He does work to pass the Keaton-Owings Act, which is a federal child labor law. However, this law is declared unconstitutional. He does intervene in a railroad strike following in the footsteps of Theodore Roosevelt. And during World War I, he actually limited a lot of civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So you can see that in terms of social issues, Wilson's kind of divided. The last big social problem that Wilson faces is the right of women's suffrage. Now, in the end, he does support women's suffrage and gets the 19th Amendment passed. However, he doesn't really want to. He doesn't really think women should vote. He actually just wants more voters to vote for him. So he's really reluctant. He's not super on board with it, but he does end up pushing it through in order to kind of increase the support of the Democratic Party. So Woodrow Wilson is the last of these really progressive presidents. The progressive era really ends with World War I breaking out into Europe, which we'll come back to later. So I hope this was a good overview for you, and I will see you later in class. Bye-bye.